The difference between an ordinary mind and a strategic one is not intelligence, it is perception. The strategic mind sees what others miss, anticipates what others react to, and moves, while others are still trying to understand what happened. What follows is 30 minutes that will change how you see everything. Most people experience the world as a series of events, things that happen, to which they respond, from which they recover, and after which they wait for the next thing to happen. This mode of experiencing the world feels natural because it corresponds to the most immediate level of reality, the level of visible, discrete occurrences that arrive with enough definition to be named, responded to, and filed away as concluded. The master strategist experiences the world at a different level, not the level of events, but the level of systems, the invisible patterns of cause and effect that operate beneath the surface of visible events, and that determine, long before any specific event occurs, the range of events that are possible within any given environment. What most people don't realize is that every event they experience as sudden, unexpected, or surprising was the predictable output of a system that was always producing it. A system whose operating patterns, had they been observed with sufficient attention over sufficient time, would have made the outcome recognizable before it arrived, rather than only comprehensible after it did. This is the foundational perceptual shift of strategic thinking, not greater intelligence applied to the same level of reality, a different level of reality being observed, the level of pattern rather than event, of system rather than incident, of structural tendency rather than individual occurrence. Few people understand that this shift is not a natural consequence of intelligence or education. It is a developed discipline, the specific product of a habit of observation that consistently asks about every visible event, not simply what happened, but what pattern produced it. Not simply what this person did, but what system of incentives, fears, and constraints would reliably produce this behavior from anyone in this position. Pay attention to what this shift produces in practical terms, because it does not simply improve the strategist's understanding of what has already occurred. It generates the capacity for anticipation that is the most consequential strategic advantage available in any competitive environment. The person who can see the pattern can see the next event before it arrives. And the person who sees what is coming before others see it has the time to position, to prepare, and to act rather than to react. This is where reading incentives before reading people reveals its function as the most reliable entry point into the systems. Level understanding that strategic thinking requires, because the systems that produce human behavior in any environment are not primarily systems of character. They are systems of incentive. Most people believe that understanding others requires understanding their personality, their fundamental traits, their characteristic ways of engaging with the world, the stable dispositions that make them recognizable across different situations. Those who understand human nature know that personality, however real and however consistent, is a significantly less reliable predictor of behavior in any specific situation than the specific incentive structure that situation presents. The person who appears generous in abundance may appear calculating in scarcity. The person who appears loyal when loyalty is costless may appear differently when loyalty requires sacrifice. The person whose character seemed entirely admirable in comfortable circumstances may reveal dimensions that comfort concealed when circumstances apply genuine pressure to competing interests. This is not hypocrisy in any simple sense. It is human nature operating as it was designed to operate, prioritizing the protection of interests that the environment has made salient above the consistent expression of values that a more comfortable environment would have allowed to remain unchallenged. The master strategist does not judge this observation, they use it before assessing what any person is likely to do in any significant situation. They first map the incentive structure of that situation, what this person stands to gain, what they stand to lose, what they fear most in this specific context, and what they want most urgently. This map, constructed before the behavior occurs, produces a predictive model of what is likely to happen that character assessment alone consistently fails to provide with equivalent accuracy. Those who understand human nature know that the most reliable model of human behavior is not what people say they will do, not what their character suggests they should do, and not what their history in comfortable circumstances would predict. It is what the incentive structure of their current situation would produce from almost anyone who found themselves in an equivalent position with equivalent stakes. Pay attention to what this principle implies for every significant relationship and every significant decision, because it implies something that most people find both uncomfortable and practically indispensable. The most important question about any person in any consequential situation is not who they are in general. It is what this situation is making it rational for them to be. And the strategist who can answer that question accurately, who can map the incentive landscape before the behavior it will produce has arrived, possesses the most practically valuable form of human understanding available, not the understanding of who people are, the understanding of what any situation will make them become. This connects directly to the strategic use of restraint, which is among the most counterintuitive and most consequential principles available to anyone seeking to understand how power actually operates in any environment where it is being accumulated, maintained, or contested. Most people believe that power is demonstrated through its deployment, that the person who acts most visibly, who exercises their capability most consistently, who makes their influence felt across the broadest range of situations, is the person who possesses the most power within any given environment. Those who understand human nature know that this belief, however intuitive it feels, consistently produces the opposite of its intended effect. Power deployed fully in every available situation does not accumulate. It exhausts. It creates the specific kind of resistance that overused force always generates, the coalition of those who have been consistently outmaneuvered and who share the common interest of preventing future outmaneuvering by the same party. Power held in visible reserve communicates something that any amount of deployment can never demonstrate with equivalent conviction. It implies a capability that has not yet been fully measured, and unmeasured capability that is known to exist but whose full extent has not yet been encountered, generates a specific quality of caution in every party who is aware of it that measured and fully deployed capability never produces. The wisest leaders recognize that the most formidable position is almost never the one that has demonstrated the most. It is the one that has demonstrated enough to be taken seriously, while reserving enough to remain genuinely uncertain as a strategic variable. History has shown that the strategic use of restraint is not simply a tactic. It is a philosophy, a fundamental understanding that the relationship between demonstrated capability and attributed power is not linear, and that the most effective management of power in any sustained competition involves the deliberate, patient calibration of what is shown and what is held back in every significant interaction. This connects directly to positioning over performance, which completes the understanding of strategic restraint by revealing what the reserved capability is being preserved for. Not the most impressive performance, the most advantageous position. Most people invest their energy in performing well wherever they currently are, in demonstrating their capability within the position they occupy and trusting that exceptional performance will produce positional advancement as its natural reward. Few people understand that the relationship between performance and position is considerably less direct than this assumption suggests. because position is not primarily determined by how well someone performs within it. It is determined by the specific configuration of relationships, information, alliances, and dependencies that surround it, and that configuration is shaped not primarily by the performance that happens within positions, but by the strategic work that happens between them. The master strategist understands that positioning the patient, deliberate work of placing oneself in a configuration from which favorable outcomes are structurally more likely, is worth more than any performance advantage in a configuration from which favorable outcomes are structurally difficult, regardless of how excellently the performance is executed. What appears to be strength is often the performance of strength from a position of structural disadvantage, and what appears to be modest capability is often the measured performance of someone who has positioned themselves so advantageously that even modest capability produces exceptional results. The strongest position is almost always the one that was built before the contest began, through the patient accumulation of the relational, informational, and structural advantages that determine which performances will be rewarded and which will be excellent but unrewarded regardless of their quality. There is a quality that separates the master strategist from every intelligent, capable, and well-intentioned person who consistently arrives at inferior outcomes, despite possessing superior raw capability. And it is not intelligence, not knowledge, not even the specific strategic principles that distinguish one approach to complex situations from another. It is patience. Not the passive patience of someone who is simply waiting, but the active, disciplined, structurally informed patience of someone who understands precisely what outcome they are positioning toward, precisely what conditions must develop before the optimal moment for action arrives, and precisely what the cost of acting before those conditions are met would be, and who maintains that understanding under the sustained pressure of circumstances that consistently make premature action feel not simply acceptable, but necessary. Most people believe that decisive action is the mark of strategic competence, that the ability to act quickly and confidently in uncertain situations is the quality that distinguishes leadership from hesitation. Those who understand human nature know that this belief, however, culturally reinforced, confuses the appearance of decisiveness with the substance of it. Genuine decisiveness is not speed. It is the specific quality of a decision made with sufficient information from a sufficiently advantaged position at a sufficiently optimal moment that it produces the intended outcome rather than simply the relief of having acted, and the patience required to arrive at that combination. The patience that allows information to accumulate, position to develop, and moment to become genuinely optimal rather than simply urgent, is not hesitation. It is the most sophisticated form of strategic discipline available. Pay attention to what premature action consistently produces in any extended competition, because the pattern is visible across every domain of consequential human endeavor. The party that acts before the information supports the action reveals their position, commits their resources, and eliminates the optionality that patience preserved, while the party that waited retains the flexibility to respond to what the premature action reveals, to exploit the commitments it created, and to act with the specific accuracy of someone who knows more than they did before their opponent acted. Few people understand that patience is therefore not simply a virtue in the conventional sense. It is a tactical advantage, the specific advantage of the party that can sustain an ambiguous position longer than their opponent can sustain the uncertainty that the ambiguity creates. The architecture of patience is built from a specific kind of internal discipline, the ability to maintain clarity about long-term objectives while tolerating the discomfort of short-term uncertainty, to resist the social and psychological pressure that sustained inaction consistently generates in environments where action is ultrally valued, and to distinguish between situations that genuinely require immediate response and situations that merely feel urgent, because the discomfort of waiting has reached a threshold that action, however premature, would relieve. This is where controlling the narrative reveals its function as patience's most powerful complement. Because patience builds position, and narrative control determines how that position is interpreted by everyone who must respond to it. Most people believe that in any competitive environment, outcomes are determined primarily by the quality of the competing capabilities, by who is stronger, smarter, better resourced, or more skillfully executing their strategy. Those who understand human nature know that this belief consistently underestimates the degree to which outcomes are shaped, not by what actually happens, but by the story that the relevant audience accepts about what happened, what it means, and what should follow from it. The party that controls this story holds an advantage that raw capability alone can never overcome, because every capability operates within a context of interpretation, and interpretation is itself a strategic variable that the most capable party does not automatically control. History has shown that some of the most consequential strategic victories in any domain were achieved not through superior capability but through superior narrative control, through the ability to define what was at stake, to establish the criteria by which success and failure would be measured, and to frame the situation in terms that made the desired outcome appear not simply preferable, but inevitable, or just. The wisest leaders recognize that narrative control is not about deception. It is about the specific and consequential power to define terms, to establish the conceptual framework within which decisions are made, options are evaluated, and outcomes are interpreted by everyone whose behavior must be aligned for the strategy to succeed. Pay attention to what narrative control produces in practical terms, because it operates not simply on external audiences, but on the internal processes of every party involved. The frame through which a situation is understood determines which options appear viable, which actions appear legitimate, and which outcomes appear acceptable. And the party that establishes the frame has determined these things before any specific decision has been consciously made by anyone operating within it. This connects directly to the intelligence of selective trust, which is perhaps the principle that most directly shapes the quality of the strategic environment any person is able to build and sustain over time. Most people extend trust as a social default, offering it generously in early interactions, withdrawing it only after it has been demonstrably violated, and experiencing the withdrawal as a painful exception to a general posture of openness that they return to as quickly as possible after each violation. Those who understand human nature know that this approach, however genuinely it reflects admirable human qualities, consistently produces a specific strategic vulnerability. The vulnerability of a person whose trust is available to anyone who has not yet provided sufficient evidence to deserve it, which is always, in the early stages of any relationship, everyone. The master strategist understands that trust is not a binary state to be granted or withheld based on a general assessment of character. It is a variable to be calibrated continuously against the specific evidence of demonstrated reliability across stakes that actually cost something to the person being trusted. The key distinction is between what people do when trustworthy behavior is costless and what they do when trustworthy behavior requires genuine sacrifice of competing interests. The former reveals nothing of strategic value. The latter reveals everything that matters for the accurate calibration of how much weight to assign to this person's commitments, when those commitments will be tested by circumstances that make honoring them genuinely expensive. Most people miss this warning sign because the evidence that matters most for trust calibration arrives precisely in the moments that are most uncomfortable to evaluate clearly, when trust has already been extended and the evidence that it was misplaced arrives in the form of a behavior that is easier to explain away than to acknowledge as the data point it actually represents. This is where the power of defined values reveals its connection to the trust intelligence. Because the person whose values are clearly defined and consistently applied in their own behavior is simultaneously the person whose trust calibration of others is most likely to be accurate. Clarity about what one genuinely values, not what one aspires to value or what one presents to social audiences as one's values, but what the actual pattern of one's choices across time and pressure consistently reveals as the operating priorities, provides the specific foundation from which every other strategic judgment is most reliably made. The person who is unclear about their own values encounters every significant decision as a fresh problem, because without defined values doing the calculation in advance, every situation of competing interests requires a new deliberation about which interest takes precedence. And deliberation under pressure consistently produces worse outcomes than the clear application of a pre-established hierarchy of values would have produced from a position of greater calm. Most people miss this principle because they believe that flexibility, the ability to evaluate each situation on its own terms, rather than through the potentially rigid application of pre-established values, is a mark of sophisticated judgment. The wisest leaders recognize that what appears as flexibility in the absence of defined values is almost always something else. It is the specific vulnerability of a person whose decisions are more influenced by the immediate social and emotional pressures of the specific situation than by any coherent long-term framework, producing a pattern of choices that appears responsive in individual instances and inconsistent across the full sequence. And inconsistency in the development of the reputation that sustained influence requires is the most quietly destructive force available. There is a dimension of strategic thinking that most people never consciously develop, not because it requires exceptional intelligence to practice, but because it requires a specific reorientation of attention that runs against the most natural direction of focus in any competitive situation. Most people, when facing an opponent or navigating a difficult environment, focus on what they themselves can do, on the capabilities they possess, the options available to them, and the moves they might make. The master strategist focuses on something different. First, what the opponent cannot do. What most people don't realize is that every opponent, however formidable their visible capability, operates within a set of constraints that are as consequential for the outcome of any contest as the capabilities those constraints limit. Political constraints that prevent certain moves, regardless of their tactical merit. Relational commitments that make specific actions impossible without costs that cannot be absorbed. Psychological limitations that create predictable patterns of avoidance around specific kinds of decision. Resource constraints that make sustained pressure in certain directions impossible to maintain. The strategist who maps these constraints accurately before determining their own course of action has access to something that capability assessment alone cannot provide: a map of the space within which the opponent cannot operate, and this space, defined by what the opponent cannot do rather than by what they can, is almost always where the most effective action is located. Few people understand that constraint mapping is among the most powerful analytical tools available precisely because it is so rarely practiced. Most competitive analysis focuses on capability, on what the opponent can do and how to counter it. The constraint map reveals what the opponent cannot do and how to exploit the space their constraints create. History has shown that the most decisive strategic advantages in any domain were almost never achieved by meeting the opponent's strength with superior strength. They were achieved by finding the space that the opponent's constraints defined, the moves they could not respond to, the positions they could not defend, the pressures they could not sustain, and operating from that space with the specific patience that its identification required. This is where the long game always wins, reveals its function as the culminating principle of everything that precedes it, because all the preceding principles are, in their deepest structure, expressions of a single strategic orientation, the orientation of the longer horizon. Most people optimize for the outcome that the immediate environment makes available, for the victory that can be achieved today, the advantage that can be secured this week, the position that the current circumstances make possible. Those who understand human nature know that this optimization, applied consistently, produces a specific and predictable long-term outcome. A person who is consistently winning immediate contests, while systematically failing to build the long-term position that would make the outcomes of those contests compoundingly more favorable, the long game operates on a fundamentally different principle, one that accepts immediate costs, apparent setbacks, and the specific social discomfort of appearing to perform less impressively than one's capability would allow, in exchange for the structural position that patient, long-horizon decision-making consistently builds. Pay attention to what this means practically, because it means that the strategist playing the long game will frequently appear to observers with shorter horizons to be performing below their potential. The restraint will look like limitation. The patience will look like hesitation. The deliberate acceptance of short-term costs for long-term structural advantage will look like the inability to compete effectively in the immediate environment. Most people miss this warning sign, not from the outside, but from the inside. The social pressure to perform impressively in the immediate environment, to demonstrate capability when capability can be demonstrated, to win when winning is possible, is among the most consistent and most consequential pressures that the strategist playing a long game must develop the specific discipline to resist. The wisest leaders recognize that the long game's ultimate advantage is not simply that it produces better outcomes over time. It is that it produces outcomes that the short game optimizer can only reach, if at all, at a cost so much greater than the long game strategist paid that the competition, by the time its decisive moment arrives, is already effectively concluded. There is a thread that runs through every principle examined in this narration, through thinking in systems rather than events, reading incentives before reading people, the strategic use of restraint, positioning over performance, the architecture of patience, controlling the narrative, the intelligence of selective trust, the power of defined values, understanding the opponent's constraints, and the long game that always wins. And it is not a thread about tactics, techniques, or the specific moves that any particular competitive situation might call for. It is a thread about a fundamentally different relationship with time, information, and the nature of how consequential outcomes are actually produced. Most people move through the world reactively, responding to what arrives, optimizing for what is immediately available, and measuring their success by the visible quality of their performance in the situations that the immediate environment presents. This mode of engaging with the world is not unintelligent. It is simply operating at the wrong level of the problem. It is solving for the event, rather than for the system that produces events. It is performing well within a position, rather than building the position from which good performance becomes structurally more likely to produce the outcomes it deserves. The master strategist operates from a different level. Not a level of superior raw intelligence, but a level of superior temporal positioning, a perspective from which the current moment is always understood as one point in a longer sequence, where today's decisions are evaluated primarily for the position they will produce when their consequences have fully developed, rather than for the immediate return they appear to offer. Few people understand that developing this perspective is not a matter of learning more information or acquiring more sophisticated analytical tools. It is a matter of developing specific internal qualities that make the longer perspective possible to maintain under the consistent pressure of an environment that rewards immediate performance and systematically undervalues long-term positioning patience. The specific patience of someone who can sustain an ambiguous position through the period of maximum discomfort, without resolving it prematurely through action, that the available information doesn't support. Emotional restraint, the discipline of not allowing the internal states that difficult situations produce to determine the quality of the decisions those situations require. Observational discipline, the habit of extending the observation window beyond the point where pattern recognition feels sufficient and committing to assessment only when the available evidence genuinely warrants the conclusion it appears to support. And above all, the clarity of defined values that makes every decision, in every situation, the application of a consistent framework, rather than a fresh deliberation under pressure, whose outcome the pressures of the moment will inevitably distort. The wisest leaders recognize that these qualities are not natural endowments distributed unequally at birth. They are developed disciplines, built through the accumulated practice of specific habits, applied consistently across the full range of situations that a life presents. From the apparently inconsequential to the genuinely decisive, power rarely announces itself, and the master strategist rarely announces themselves. They simply continue building quietly, patiently, from a longer horizon than anyone around them has yet adopted, until the position they constructed is visible to everyone as the decisive advantage it was always becoming. The strongest position is the one built before the contest was recognized as a contest. Begin building it now.